Hello and welcome to Setting the Stage, episode 40, Kevin and Wingwomen. I've seen a lot of growth in the show over the last few months, and I'd like to keep it going. You can help by rating and reviewing the show on your favorite podcast app, telling a friend, or by telling any game masters you know to send in a survey to be on the show. You can find that survey at gocorral.com/STS. That's GOCORRAL.com/STS. And on to the show. Today I'm here with Kevin from the Wingwoman podcast. Hi, Kevin.
Hello.
How are you doing today?
I'm sweaty. I was just running the vacuum and it gets hot, so I'm pretty warm. It's pretty warm by me, but I'm otherwise very good. I'm very excited to be here.
Yeah, I'm in California in Davis, and I think the high today is 110.
I gotta shut my northeastern ass up then. Wow. Okay.
And I'm in the only unair conditioned room in my house. So
Good luck. I'm sorry.
Time. Yeah, and I need to close the door because of the sound control kind of stuff. So yeah, it's fun. I've got a fan going that hits my feet. I'm feeling nice and comfy.
Good.
Right. So before we get into talking about the Wingwoman campaign and RPGs and all of that, can we get a quick blurb on who is Kevin outside of D&D and RPGs and stuff?
I am a actor local to the Philadelphia area. Aspiring actor at the very least, as much as one can be consistently working right now. Yep. I do document analysis for regular work. Love movies, probably too much. And I really, really enjoy collecting old, weird paperback books, like mass market paperback books from the 50s are something that I often find myself shopping for, which is admittedly an odd habit, but boy, howdy, is it fun to look at the covers.
Cheap, too, I think. You can get them for like $1 at most bookstores.
Yes, you can. There's a wonderful, wonderful little bookstore called Second Time Books near me that is like an entire huge room of just old sci-fi and fantasy paperbacks like, Piers Anthony all the way through Douglas Adams and Terry Pratchett and everything in between. And everything there is like at most $4. It's wonderful.
Oh, yeah. I remember walking around used bookstores like that when I was a kid, just like finding whatever I like whatever cover looked cool and going with it.
Yeah, I still do that, and I will often pay the price, but sometimes it really works out.
Yes. Now, at this point, I'm like going with more like top 10 lists kind of stuff for book recommendations. But
Goodreads helps a lot.
Yes. Yep. What got you into RPGs at some point?
I used to very often read the AV Club. That's where I got a lot of like entertainment news. Mm-hmm. And they used to do a really cool feature of like, what are you doing this weekend of their staff writers? And they don't have staff writers anymore because whoever owns them now, I think it's Geo Media, is a capitalist hellscape. But when they did, they would recommend stuff. So they'd do like, check out this theater show, check out this song, check out this album. And a game they suggested once was Fiasco by Jason Morningstar of Morningstar Games, now Pulpit Games. Yeah. And they build it as like, this is, if you have actor friends, play it with them. And I am an actor, so I have actor friends, and I wanted to play it with them. So I ordered a copy, and then eventually the first game night I ever hosted, which was 1 month before the pandemic, was to play that game and had a really great time.
Perfect.
Yeah.
So you started off with the Fiasco, and from what I remember, Wingwoman is also a Bully Pulpit game.
It is, and it is Morningstar as well. That's actually why I picked it up in the first place. When I turned 24, I think, 24, Julianne, who is our editor, who plays Tati, who is a huge integral part of the podcast. Her and her husband got me a gift card to a local game cafe, and I saw the game on their shelves, and I used the gift card to buy it, and that's where I got the idea for the show, was in that moment, and then it's built out from there with the team that we have.
That's funny. It feels like the type of game that probably would not be in most physical locations for buying, unfortunately.
No, it is very rare. I was very lucky that shout out to Queen and Rook Cafe in Philadelphia.
Mhm.
that their old game shop location, they had like two copies. And then everything else was like D&D, Vampire the Masquerade. It was all the big ones. So
Mhm.
it was
Of
this
course.
little peak of indie gaming, which I was so thrilled by.
Yeah. No, and it seems like it's a pretty cool game, especially from like a spectator standpoint, because I feel like a lot of other games get kind of bogged down in like combat aspects, whereas it feels
Hmm.
like this just keeps the action and the storytelling moving much better.
Yeah, I think I compared it. We did like a season one retrospective, and I compared it to the movie Raging Bull, which I'm a huge fan of, which is
Hmm.
very different from what we're trying to do. But the way they portray boxing in that movie is it's all very emotional storytelling.
Uh-huh.
So at one point, like the character's so keyed up, and it's like it's not even a question of what kind of fight it's going to be or if he's going to win the fight. He's going to win the fight and it's going to be brutal. So they only show like two still photographs of the fight. And that's the entire fight scene. And I think Wing Women is similar where it doesn't get bogged down in like how do you do your maneuver, how do you it's like no you got to find the place, you got to bomb it, there's a way this goes, because that's I think reflective of the real life experience of these women and how they would have ran their missions is there wasn't
Mhm.
a lot of improvisation unless things go wrong.
Right. Yeah. I mean, they're doing like 10 raids a night or something. It becomes very formulaic for them.
Yeah.
I feel like my touchstone for the idea comes from the Enemy at the Gates movie, but that I feel like I get what you're saying. That's still a very like combat focused movie.
Hmm.
Have you seen that one?
I haven't. I've seen clips from it on TikTok because TikTok's now just dad movies.
Uh,
Not to denigrate the movie, but
it
it's like
is though.
that.
It is. It's a World War II dad movie for sure.
Yeah, and I love them. Hey, I'm doing a podcast called Wing Women. I talk to me about Band of Brothers any day. Um, but no, I hear you. Like yeah, war movies they will kind of get into the weeds of the combat, but the combat does tend to move pretty quick, at least compared to something like like an episode of Critical Role where I think there's a relish in the fight. I think the nature of war stories, which invariably when they depict war it can get very like this is hard to take in. It then it doesn't have the same relish that like a fantasy combat system will have in a sword fight because it's a very different type of fighting.
Yeah, it doesn't feel as like heroic necessarily.
Hmm.
Yeah, I feel like just our view of modern warfare is much more brutal compared to medieval warfare, where there was this like honor and glory aspect to it.
Yeah. There were like rules of engagement, and even before the fantasy element gets into it, like there is just something more interesting about a one-on-one fight to then dig into that combat,
Mhm.
or like a fight between like one strong warrior and a bunch of like medium strength warriors, like a Witcher fight or something, where I think it is more engaging to spend some time in there as opposed to like at a certain point you're just watching someone shoot a gun and it's like this is terrifying.
Yeah, I come back to the Enemy at the Gates. I think that's one of the reasons that movie was so popular is because it brought the sort of glory aspect back to it a little bit.
Mm.
I mean, in contrast that with like Saving Private Ryan, which is still very brutal and um, like it almost got an X rating in the U.S. because of all the violence in it.
I didn't know that about Saving Private Ryan.
Yeah, it was going to get an X rating, but they decided to give it just R because of the historical relevance of all the violence.
Fascinating. Wow. I shocked shocked that they would have even dared to give Spielberg an X rating, but goes to show you just how intense that movie is.
Yeah, and I feel like they sort of backed off of giving X ratings to violence at this point as well, because I feel like, Saw is like the Saw series has a lot of gruesome violence, but it's not, those are just R.
Yeah, I think X has always been more of a sexual thing anyway. But
Mm,
yeah,
yeah.
I don't know the last time I heard about an X-rated movie coming out.
I mean, because usually if your movie is going to get rated X, you don't bother submitting it to the MPAA
Sure.
for rating it. So no one's going to watch your movie if it's X rated.
Yeah.
Well, back to the concept we're talking about, not MPA ratings. Um, I feel like we should give some background on what the story that you're telling is actually about, because I know we're sort of circling it with World War II and movies and stuff. So why don't you tell us what the Wing Wingman setting is, just to start with that.
Sure. So the largest view of it that's important to know is that the Nazis invade Russia in 1941, if I remember correctly. It's like summer of 41. Obviously, they'd been working their way through Europe at that point. They kick off with the invasion of Poland in September of 39. And Stalin had a pact with Hitler. Everyone kind of knew that the pact was going to fail. So it was just a matter of when. Um, the Nazis kind of tear through Russia at an unprecedented rate. Um, it's a combination of the tactics that Hitler was using and the Nazi army was using, which were incredibly effective at just like pushing, 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 pushing. And then Russia, which because of its kind of tenuous state post-revolution, the establishment of the Communist Party as the dominant political force, they were not as well prepared for an invasion as they thought. And a lot of that falls down onto corruption within that system, which is a well-worn stereotype at this point, but was a big part of why, like, there are accounts that I've read from young women who later joined the military of like one day everything was fine. The next day people were like, I heard we might have to evacuate soon. And then the next day a Nazi plane was like shooting their house down. That's how quick they were moving through it and just how ill prepared they were for a ground invasion. So flash forward to 1942, it's such an unprecedented fight to push back against them that Soviet Union is the only major allied power that mobilizes women as part of its armed forces beyond a nurse's corps, beyond the types of roles that they would have fit into French, in the French army or French resistance rather, in the English army, in the American army. You have women engineers, you have women pilots, bombardiers, navigators, rifle women, and that's to say nothing of the partisans who work behind the lines. It is one of the largest scale examples of women in combat in modern war history. And one of those units was the 588th Bombers Unit, later the 42nd Taman Guard Unit, which they get for their very heroic guarding of the Taman region in Russia. I hope I'm saying that right.
Sounds right.
Thank you. Thanks. They Marina Raskova, who was like Russian Amelia Earhart. She is a good friend of Stalin. She was an opera singer. She was a pilot. She was just this bon vivant. And she convinces Stalin, let me get three groups of women who are, flying these missions. It ends up being one co-ed, two women only. That's the 586, the 587, 588. The 588 ran night bombing missions with a focus of harassment, and they did so with what are called, I think, P2 biplanes. These are outdated, like 20s, 30s biplanes whose primary use at that point in Russia were either crop dusters or training. It's just how you taught people how to fly. This is a very easy thing to use to fly. They had such little allowance for weight that they could only fit like 6 bombs on them. So that's why they had to run so many missions in the night, is they could only fit so many bombs to run missions with.
Right.
And yeah, they mobilize in June of 1942. That's when our current season is set. June through August of 1942. And then, yeah, I mean, not to spoil it, the Russians eventually do win their part of the war.
Ah, shocker.
Yeah, it's thank God. Um, at least on that point in history. But yeah, they ran missions pretty much every night for the remainder of the war. They are eventually forced to retreat as the Germans push further in. Winter, as it does, stops everyone but the Russians, so they start to be able to push back. And eventually, by 1945, we all meet in the middle somewhere west of Berlin. Yeah, west of Berlin essentially. But
Hmm.
yeah, that's kind of the background. That's the real life background. There's I'll take a quick second if I can to just shout out two books, which if you are interested in women in the Soviet military in World War II in particular, and then this group in particular, The Unwomanly Face of War by Svetlana Alexievich, who wrote the book on Chernobyl as well, is a great resource for women in all aspects of warfare in the Soviet Union in World War II. And then The Dance of Death by Anne Nagel, which I do think is out of print, but there's quite a few used copies floating around that aren't hard to get your hands on, is one-on-one interviews by this American photojournalist where she has a lot of great photos of the original Night Witches, them in their 70s, I believe, as well when she interviews them, and then these firsthand accounts of what everyone's experience was going through that. And both of those have been valuable resources for us and are just great books.
Oh, that's cool. I didn't think you were also doing sort of that that deep a level of research for the show as well. That's cool.
I like to have a healthy mix of accuracy without getting sued is kind of how I like to think of it. Where the only real life character we've featured in the show so far was Marina Raskova, whose life story is insane. She's awesome. But then other than that, I'm inventing characters and I'm taking elements from real figures because there are some really interesting people who served with them. One woman went on to be a film director, and her interview is buck wild. And I introduced a character this season based on her, and people keep like kind of being like, that was a real person. I'm like, yeah, she said this shit to her friends, and they'd be like, why? It's like, I don't know.
Oh man, yeah. I was wondering how many real characters you were bringing in because there's that because I've listened to the first 2 episodes and there's that officer that rips the propeller off their plane initially. And I
Popov, I
was
think
thinking,
is his name.
yeah, and I was
Yeah.
trying to find this must be a real person, right? And I did find a General Popov or a Colonel, whatever, but he's currently alive and still serving. So
I
nope,
did,
that's not the right guy.
I did the same thing. I think the book, the Night Witches book itself, as written by Jason Morningstar, encourages that kind of mix of real life history, but like don't the point of I think a TTRPG actual play is you're really inventing stuff whole cloth at a certain point. So don't try and recreate stuff because the dice aren't going to care about your script. They're just going to do what they want to do.
Yeah, and I feel like if you wanted to have that level of realism, you could do it where you like all the people are named correctly and have the right personalities for who they're supposed to be. But yeah, like you said, you what's your reward for that besides just accuracy?
Yeah, and it's especially like a lot of these people have living descendants. Not that I think we're going to be a big hit in Russia, but especially because I knew early on our intention was to lean into the queer themes that will naturally develop in a setting like this
Uh-huh.
with the characters. That's something where if you're creating a named character that is based on a real woman, and then that named character is like queer, someone might be like, I don't think that was reflective of my grandma, and I have a problem with that. And I
Hmm.
wanted to avoid that possibility, if nothing else. So, yeah,
Yeah.
names, everything. We have the little reminder. Even all names events are fictitious, even the real people, something like that.
Yeah. Yes, I do remember that. Yeah, and I think some of the Night Witches are still alive today, aren't they? Like
A
they're
few. They were quite
yeah,
young. They're I think the eldest when they first started out were like 24, 25. So
right.
they'd be pushing 100 this year, but they were. It's certainly possible. I don't. I've looked this up a couple times for different things. Like, I know there are people who are in Easy Company, which are the Band of Brothers guys who are still alive. So we have not yet reached a point where we're getting those news stories of like the last member of this unit passed away, this famous unit.
Right. Yeah. Well, I was thinking like it's three different regiments that each had like 500 people in them.
Yeah.
So 1,500 people. There's got to be at least a few that are still alive. But
yeah.
Okay. Well, so the 588. I think this is one of the cool stories. How did they get the Night Witches nickname?
Well, since you set it up so well.
Uh-huh.
The German term, which I love the German language and all its ferociousness, is Nachthection. And the Night Witches was a Nazi term. The way they would do their missions is they're obviously flying at night when things are still loud, but there's more ability to hear an engine incoming. And because they were so slow moving, if they had forewarning, the Nazis would be able to like shoot them down with a rifle. So what they would do is they'd get to the right altitude, they'd line up with their target, and then they'd cut their engine. And what it sounded like on the ground was like a broom sweep. That's how contemporary accounts from like the German and the Hungarian forces who were part of the invasion of Russia would say. It was like it was like a broom sweeping in the sky, and you had, when it first started, no one had any idea what that could be, and then shit would just blow up, and it terrified them, and they were remarkably effective. What their mission was harassment. They essentially were just trying to make sure that the invading forces could not rest. And yeah, that's how they got the name. It was as if it was a witch's broom. They particularly were fixed on that when they found out that these were women who were bombing them, because the Germans, they had a very gender entrenched society when it came to the military. So the idea that women were the ones in particular who were harassing them at night so effectively was galling to them.
Yeah, I think that's one of the reasons that they kept the women Air Force like operational, was because of the sort of psychological damage it was giving the Germans.
Yeah, I have to imagine that helped a lot. That as much as the Soviet Union had their own issues with gender in that respect of their society, they were remarkably forward in some areas, but not quite where they wanted to be in others. They recognized the value in the propaganda of these invaders who think they're so strong and powerful, having to face, someone who, like our characters in the show, are like is 5'2" and looks like a little cherub and is dropping death from the sky.
Right. And maybe the book addresses this, but I was curious why you went for the 588 over the 66, the 67, or 86, 87. My bad.
The 588 were the ones who flew the most outdated biplanes, and they were the ones who were assigned this specific task. It's been a minute since I've read more about the missions of the 86 and the 87. I think the reason we wouldn't do the 86, at least in terms of the story we're trying to tell, is that's the one where they're working with men. And I think that's an interesting story, but we wanted to focus on like, what is a war story told through a female soldier's perspective? And then, having an ensemble that is entirely female is very helpful in that. Obviously, having the game master be male presents some concerns on that, but that's something we were trying to be hyper vigilant about when we were designing the show. And one of the ways I try to GM is to let the characters make actions and then respond as best I can, to not impose that perspective on it. Because our original concept was, I was actually not even going to GM about 80% of the show. We had another individual who is going to be part of the team who I did not clear using their name, so I'm not going to say their name, but I love this
Okay.
person. They know who they are. And they were going to run all the day stuff, and then I was going to be the one in charge of running combat missions.
Oh, okay.
And I was going to run, like, if there were, like, male characters who became significant, I would kind of bring that in, and we kind of wanted to let that be the thing. This person got some great work opportunities that conflicted with what our recording schedule was going to be when we were planning out the show, so they bowed out. And we were not. We ran a couple sessions with just me running the whole thing and determined that the show worked. The concerns that I had were not a concern when we ran it. So that's why we didn't do the 586. Long answer to that. And then 587, I think, ran daytime missions on more modern bombers. I think bombers that were akin to like the B-2 bomber that the Americans were
Yeah, I
using
think
at the
there
same
was
time.
one of them got planes that like the male Air Force was jealous of.
Yeah, I think it was like the PO2. It's very confusing. Everything has very similar names. This is the
Yes.
constant problem with everything Russian in fiction, is everything sounds alike. But they were these huge bombers. I think they had a crew of four, and they were very contemporary. They're really state of the art for the time. But they could still break your neck if you didn't brace properly for landing.
Uh, Wonderful feature. Uh,
Yeah.
okay. Yeah, I was. And is that a choice that the rule book presents to you, or was that the one that you chose to make when you were doing the setup for this?
The book is explicitly about the 588. They are the missions and the group it tracks. The way the missions are built out are about the real life exploits of that particular unit, and marking their historical path, which is part of why we wanted to do historical research. Was the book is rife with its own historical research.
Hmm. Okay, gotcha. Well, before we get into your campaign, I feel like I wanted to explore like the rule system itself first.
Okay.
So I know it's a 2d6 system from listening to the podcast, and it has, I'm assuming, like gradations of success based off of stuff.
Yeah, there are three levels of success. There is anything above a 10, so 10 to 12, which is total success. Mission goes off without a hitch, or you get exactly what you want, no consequences. 7 to 9, which is you get what you want, but there's a catch. So what that will mean is in mission, your plane will suffer a mechanical failure, or you're able to get there, but you suffer enemy fire, so you have to roll for that, or something along those lines. Or there'll be a social consequence for what are called the day moves. The game separates the missions with night moves and the daytime in the camp with day moves,
Hmm.
and you can get flack for that. And then anything below a 6 is total failure. It will either kind of just say like, "Great, GM decides what happens. It's bad," or it will be like you have to take all of the things from the previous. Like the list of things that could go wrong, or something like that, and you don't then get what you want either.
Okay, so pretty similar to a lot of other like narrative games with the graded success.
Yeah.
And then do the characters have like bonuses to each of these based off of character creation, whatever?
Yeah, I think the four, it's luck, skill, guts, and medals. So it's anything up to +3 in any given area, except medals, which I think is just like however many medals you got, that's your medals.
Okay.
Yeah, it's pretty fun. It is literally like you hit your chest and go, listen to me," and your
Yeah, very
chest
Russian.
jangles. Yeah. um, but yeah, so those are the kind of four skills in place of like traditionally in like a D&D system, you'd have like constitution, all that stuff. It is, are you lucky? Do you have the skills to get through this? And do you have like the chutzpah essentially to get through this? And different character classes have different like benefits from that. Classes are also kind of odd in the game. So there's I forget the exact terms for it. I sincerely apologize, but the playbook is like named after a bird, and that is your personality type, and
Okay.
then there is a further. So the three kind of like things that define character are nature, roles, and rank. So
Mhm.
the nature is the one that is based on a bird. So there is hawk, owl, pigeon, raven, sparrow, and then roles are social obligations that this is a quote from the book. Roles are social obligations that your airwomen naturally fall into as part of a group: adventurer, dreamer, leader, misanthrope, protector, zealot. And then rank, which is exactly what it sounds like. You would be all the characters would either be a sergeant, junior lieutenant, or lieutenant.
Okay. And does this include like their role within the like navigator or pilot for when they're flying the planes, or is that
That
separated?
doesn't. That is separate. Yeah. So there's either you have one of two jobs. If you're in the group, you're either a pilot or a navigator. And every group runs with three planes, if I remember correctly. At least as the book has it. So three pilots and three navigators to a group.
And do the characters also get like special abilities, or is it all pretty much just number based for what they're doing?
They do have the ability to gain special abilities based on missions that will kind of uh, build up. So they're called advances. So you don't level up in the game. You advance, and that can get you a medal, that can get you a new ability. So every nature has their own specific moves that they can do, and these are things that can like mitigate unfortunate things in camp. Where if you're someone who your nature is such that you're very gregarious, your moves will then also help you avoid social like downfalls in camp if something bad
Okay,
happens. But you also might not then have as much of an ability to mitigate bad things when the bombs are going off.
I see. And how is it from like a DM perspective or GM, I guess, whatever the name is for the that role?
Just a GM in this game. It's interesting. It's really fun. I I love not having the like magic as a like back pocket thing to get out of tough situations,
Hmm.
which I find really good. I am like the one GM you'll probably ever talk to who's just like, I don't like fantasy. It does nothing for me, unfortunately. Um,
I was going to
so
ask about that because you started from Fiasco instead of the normal D&D entry into RPGs.
we can, yeah. If you want to ask about that later, we can have a conversation about my unfortunate relationship with fantasy. But yeah, I mean, as far as the game goes, the thing that's really helpful about this, and we're kind of dealing with this in season two, where without giving too much away, they overall have been doing very well. And that is not reflective of both like what the real life experience of a wartime unit would be, and also just like what makes for interesting gameplay. So the book is very plain about like, have they done really well, like three missions in a row? Cool. You can just start blowing them up. Just, yeah, just like, cool. Nazis are in the sky. They found them. Doesn't matter that they did really well tonight. It just, it's unfortunate. They've been really nice and helpful to this character. That character can still, like, have an awful thing happen to them. Or, like, people still die. The system is very clear. Like, what I like about the setting that is counter to, I think, most TTRPGs I've otherwise played in, even ones that are based on like well-known properties. Like I play in a home Bleach game that yeah, a friend of the podcast, shout out to this person, runs. It's really fun where we just got to an episode where I think a character was supposed to die, and then we just made it so that that character didn't die, and in fact probably gets to have as happy an ending as they're going to get, because that's kind of how TTRPGs typically work. Is
Hmm.
best laid plans will go to heck with that, but
I feel like the setting for Bleach also has a lot of options for keeping people alive.
it's yeah, it's helpful. I'm playing a cleric, so I both killed and saved a man's life. It was odd. It was great. But yeah, this is the reality of something like World War II, that is hard to reflect in a game where it's like they can just have a really good streak and that's just how it goes, is that just doesn't happen in life when there is like an industrial design to everyone dies or suffers. So the book kind of allows for that possibility by saying like they can do everything right and you can then just say, sorry, you still have to go through enemy fire. Sorry, this person still suffers like a nervous breakdown and they have to get pulled from active duty. Sorry, your brother who also signed up for the war is like dead or whatever. Like all these things can exist and can just happen if the GM determines they've been doing really well. We need to kind of remember what's at stake and what the reality of their situation is.
Hmm. Yeah. I think if I remember right, the casualty rates for the 588 were significantly lower than most pilots in World War II. For most
It
pilots,
was,
it was like a 50% casualty rate, and the 588 was only 20%.
yeah, which is still 1 in 5, which like, and that
Yes.
is, it's so like there's such a when you read about warfare, I find this so fascinating and stomach churning almost, where you'll read things it's like this was a great success of a military operation. Only 1,000 people died. It's like that is a horrific statement. That we have to view that is the nature of warfare. Is like a good day is when that little people died, and that's still 1,000 people.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah, I think
and
D-Day is viewed as this huge success for the Allies, but 5,000 Allies died during that
exactly, it's like
operation.
yes, like it is a strategic success, but yeah, the human cost is just it's yeah, it is kind of the central tension of part of why I want to do the show is like I find that world, that reality fascinating, and I'm so grateful first of all that I don't have to live through a time like that. Knock
Yeah.
on wood. And also just like fascinated, like what does that do to a person? Like we talk about like when people come back, World War II veterans in particular, it's this whole thing of when they came back, there was not always an adequate social net to deal with what they had to deal with.
Hmm.
And there are people, I'll give an example from my own life. My mother's father was a Navy guy. In fact, both of my parents' fathers were Navy guys. My mother's father was on a supply ship in the Pacific Ocean, and he refused to talk about his military service. And at one point, I asked my mom about it. I think when I was somewhat younger, because I was just curious. Because I asked, like, I imagine being on a supply ship that he didn't encounter, things that were as intense as someone who might have been serving, like in a Marine Corps unit in Japan or in an Army unit in, um, North Africa or something. And
Right.
my
Yeah.
mom just kind of gently explained to me, like, well, your grandfather was like his ship was part of a survey post Hiroshima, I think. Um,
Oh, yeah. Okay.
and yeah, and it's like, okay, so he doesn't talk about it, and like that was just that's his life, is he just does not talk about 4 whole years of his life essentially, which is insane. And was reflected in the research we did with the Night Witches, where a lot of them were very hesitant to talk about their service because it's hard. It was a hard time in their lives.
Yeah, that's been my experience as well, as anybody who has been in active combat duty as a soldier does not want to talk about it, except
Yeah,
with other soldiers, essentially.
yeah,
And then the people that were more in the back doing operational stuff, they're more willing to talk about their service.
yeah, yeah. It is interesting how that develops, and that is it is also one of those things. Part of why I was curious about a World War II story is, in my historical estimation, at least for Americans, World War II was kind of the last time where people don't regret. There's no cultural association the way that we have with like the Vietnam War and to some extent the Korean War.
Hmm.
not speaking toward anyone's experiences with it, but where there's a great deal of controversy about why those wars.
Right. Yeah, World War II was viewed, like everyone who came home was viewed positively, but a lot of wars since then, that has not been the case for the U.S. military.
Yeah. But yeah, so the last time, yeah, and specifically the last time where it's like you just kind of had to do it. And there was a cultural, particularly for, I mean, this is gets to the Russian aspect of it. There's a wonderful HBO podcast about Chernobyl, and the head writer on Chernobyl, Craig Mazin, talks about it, where it's like Chernobyl was a problem that only the Russians could have made and only the Russians could have fixed, because this is like the society in the 20th century that really values sacrifice and honors sacrifice. There is just a cultural expectation, like, this is just what you got to do, because life is hard, and then you have to just meet that challenge, and maybe it kills you, and that's just your life, and hopefully it was a good thing.
I'd say there's more cultures besides Russia that do that. Like, even just within World War II, like Japan had a very sacrifice-focused military. But yes, not disagreeing on Russia also having that type of culture at that period.
Yeah, it is certainly a Eurocentric view of that idea of duty and honor, but I think, at least if you compare it to an American perspective, where I think,
yes, for sure,
yeah, that it sticks out as that of like, it's also, America joined the war for a number of reasons. The war, they were Russia was invaded. They really had no choice but to fight back in the context of how they had to respond to Nazi expansionism.
Yeah, yes, and also just given the like Nazi ideology, like this was not just a normal invasion; it's an invasion that's going to exterminate portions of their population and enslave other ones.
Yeah.
I guess I'm not sure what a normal invasion is that doesn't have those as the options, but anyways.
We just wanted another beach.
Yeah, we're just here for. Yeah.
That's how it starts. Anyway.
We already touched on this before, but I was curious how you approached sexism within the game. And you talked about like having the alternate GM set up, and it's worked out with you being the GM, and I talked about like that the officer Popov that rips the propeller off of their plane in like the first episode because he doesn't want women around and he hates them, and then they later find like a pile of broken propellers because he's been doing this constantly.
It's where it does turn into a bit of a cartoon. I have to admit, we're if you picture us as an animated sitcom, it works really well. So
it's an improv comedy drama is what I've framed it as in my head.
Yeah, the way I explained it to my parents, who were born in 1963 and really don't understand anything that I'm doing, I was like, remember MASH? It's kind of like the tone of MASH, but we roll dice, and it's just a radio play. Remember radio plays? You used to listen to those, actually used to listen. Anyway.
Yes, podcasts are just modern radio.
Yeah.
For sure. Yeah, so like there's that approach to sexism, but I feel like a lot of the resistance to women going into the military went beyond that and more into the lines of like not wanting relationships between people to disrupt the chain of command, for one thing, or like you said, the military is about sacrifice in a lot of places. So one of the reasons that people were against having women in the military and still are is because then a soldier might disobey an order because they have a relationship with someone that order threatens.
Mm-hmm.
So I and there's other aspects to this question too, of just like sexual violence being undoubtedly an aspect of wars, and how you handled those issues within the campaign.
Yeah, I'll take a second. I do want to just address the sexual violence question.
Yeah, it's a layered question, so yeah,
It is because it's such an important one, and I think the best way I can think to just address that is I have not been able to find official accounts, published official accounts from anyone who was a woman who was an active military member um, from the Soviet Union during World War II, where there is a description of sexual violence that was done by a fellow military, like a comrade. Um, both of the books I mentioned earlier do discuss how female prisoners of war were the victims of sexual violence and horrific violence beyond that, as is wont for the Nazis.
Right.
So I will say that there is such an issue in militaries that do have co-ed forces, such as the U.S. military,
Mhm.
of both sexual violence and cover-ups of that sexual violence,
Right.
where the culture is that. I was not able to find that much information about that in the setting that we're exploring, so that's not something I expect to cover because I don't feel comfortable putting that onto this story if it's not something that I can find the historical record for, even though something like that almost certainly did happen. I would feel more comfortable addressing it if I could have someone's account of it and then their account of their reaction to it to kind of work off of.
Mhm. Yeah, that's also been what I've read when I've read about the integration of women into the Soviet military, was that it largely did not have internal issues with that. That there wasn't really much disruption that happened, and the issues I was talking about, like breaking the chain of command, also weren't a problem.
Mm-hmm.
That it largely worked successfully.
Yeah.
And I guess the exterior sexual violence also isn't an issue because they're flying planes, so there's never actual contact with the enemy.
Yeah, the only like the closest I think we would get to that is if there was a discovery of the aftermath of that kind of violence, as they are, traveling forward and retaking previously occupied land. And
Yeah.
there are accounts of that are quite disturbing and quite
Yes. Mhm.
yeah.
That's for a different podcast to talk about.
It's for a different. That's not for MASH, which is what we're going for. But,
Yeah.
no, but as far as the aspects of sexism, I mean, you have the kind of overt stuff where, as you mentioned, the character of the general or the head of the men's unit, who, like, the specific instances, he sees one of the women's plane on the runway hasn't been taxied away yet, which isn't their fault, and then demolishes the propeller as punishment, which is it's a kind of extreme form of sexism. There's also just like the the societal sexism, where it's like, we didn't think you guys were going to be here, so they didn't have clothes that fit them, they didn't have proper sanitary facilities for them, or sanitary menstrual products, and stuff like that, which you run into. And then there was kind of a gamut. The interesting thing about this particular unit is, because it's an all-female unit, you run into, I think, more abstract versions of sexism, where it's like, you guys are not well stocked for anything. You don't even have good food because no one really cares about you. But it's not like someone's going to come to camp and be like, we don't care about you. You don't get food this week. It's just like, well, the food didn't show up because they gave it to the riflemen, and they thought they needed it more. So we just have to make you. So I think it is, as we have explored it so far, and as we continue, we have some stuff coming up in season 2 where we have some male characters in the camp, and we have, like, patriarchal behaviors, which I don't think any of the characters think they're being sexist. I think they're just acting from their place of power as, men with power, and they don't view. I'm playing these bad guys, so I gotta understand their perspective. But yeah, so it's that kind of a thing. As the camps continue and as they change, we're going to be into more direct competition with the men again. So we'll get more stuff similar to near the end of the first season. We had a kind of direct conflict with a male flying ace from one of the different units. That was just about like women should not be better than me, and he's punishing them for being in any way better than him or taking attention away from him. So yeah, I think the general approach is like, it's all about entrenched power. When that power feels threatened, they kind of will then bring that gender into it, and will, I think the common view of these women, because they were so young, was a very condescended infantilization of them, even though a lot of them had the same flying record as any of the men.
Right. Just thinking of what you were saying about like the supplies being sent to the riflemen. And I had this thought in my brain of it being like a microaggression, but on like a macro scale.
It's a supply side logistics microaggression. Macroaggression is kind of, that's a perfect word for it. I have to steal that. If I use that in the show, I'm going to credit you. Thank you for that.
Well, yeah, I think that's all the discussion I wanted to do about the setting. You want to talk about the campaign now?
Sure. Yeah, so we're in the middle of our second season. We've been running since I think it was January of 2023 we premiered. We ran through until about August, and then we had an October Halloween special. Then we had to take an extended break just because at that point we were still meeting in person, but we're now back into regular production. We are currently in the middle of season 2. We just released episode 6. We are focusing on one group within the 588, made up of 6 characters. The main characters are Tatiana, played by Julianne Kastner, Ninochka, played by August Hochvog, Rita, who's played by Elsa Kegelman, and the wonderful, wonderful Demetria, played by Madison Cadulo. The other 2 are NPCs, and it just follows them. We are kind of doing the best structural comparison is like Band of Brothers. We are following them from training to the end of the war. And we release episodes every 2 weeks. And I know that's the elevator pitch on like what our show is, but yeah, whatever curiosities you have or things we want to expand on, I'm happy to go into.
Well, so you said earlier that it's sort of player driven. So you're kind of more responding to them. And I know you're in the second season now, but for the first season, did you have like a overarching plot that you were laying out, or were you mostly just responding to player actions and player goals?
I go into these first 2 seasons, I went in with thematic interests. And the one on season 1, I think it's kind of classic and a bit of a trope at this point, but just like bringing the Avengers together. How do we get this team working as a unit? So the first couple episodes, I just was throwing problems at them that they could solve as a group, but they could also try and solve individually. And the more they were trying to do things individually, the less it would work. And eventually they were faced with the problem that only they could work together as a group. And that coincides with them like starting to do better in missions with the dice. So the dice were on our side, thank God. And that was kind of the focus there. The second season has been about like, why do you keep going? Like, what are you fighting for? And then what is at stake? So I've been trying to deepen relationships within the camp and give people to care about, some romance, some friendships, and then we're in the middle of like a character who one of our PCs has developed a very strong friendship with is like going through a major crisis, and it is affecting everybody, and now it's this kind of thing of like, now that you have a group that works, you have to stress test it to see if it continues to work. I go in, whatever I plan, I try to plan like problems, I let them respond to it, and then I'll build in the episode from there. And I just try to have a thematic idea that like, what is this season going to be about that is motivating the problems I'm coming up with.
Okay. And I know that some of the players have relationships with, player characters have relationships with people outside of the camp. Like I think one of them was getting letters from her brother,
Mm.
and I know that some of the NPC characters had like one of them had a husband. Um,
Yeah.
so is that sort of outside relationship stuff that you're always the one bringing in, or do the players have some agency to be like, my brother wrote me a letter and here's what it said, kind of thing?
Sometimes the existence of the brother, that's all the players. So that specifically, Nino, the character played by August, has a very strong relationship with her brothers, and is constantly checking the mail for the brothers.
Uh-huh.
Um, so the two letters that we've had in the show so far were written by me, and the contents were not known ahead of time to the players. Um, Kind of at this point, if they don't exist in the immediate orbit of the players, I kind of have taken a bit of a license. I don't try to ascribe like your brother was secretly evil or something, and
Uh-huh.
like that would be, that would kind of, I think, uh, be disrespectful toward the relationship I have with them, as players. But what abuses might be being suffered by NPCs outside of camp, that's kind of my domain at this point. So I have free wheel to like, this character is missing, this character is in trouble for this or this and this. And if it's something where I'm like, I don't know if that's what this person had in mind for the character, I'll check in with them, but we haven't run into anything like that just yet. I think as we get more into the NKVD, which is the secret kind of police CIA equivalent in this world.
Yeah, I was just
Um,
about to ask about like, we're talking about what's at stake, and I feel like there's this other aspect to Russian society about the sort of thought police portion of what they were doing.
yes, which was less of a thing now than it would be, like now being 1942, than it
Uh-huh.
would be like 8 years later.
Right.
Um, where Stalin, for his faults, was, he cared about his people. He didn't want them to lose World War II, and he didn't want to, like, he did care, to the extent that like he didn't want people to suffer through that. Um, Things got really bad after World War II for Stalin, and for everyone consequentially, because they were bad for him. Um, so it's not going to get to the extent of something like The Death of Stalin, the movie, by the guy from Veep, but we do have. I have intentions to bring that into it. There is structures within the book to get into that stuff. It's a lot to pile on with the early aspects of the war as well. So I
Mhm.
think we've been holding off on that until it feels like it's, something like a season where it's about betrayal. That's where it would be great to bring that in and to have that be the pressure. But we've had a couple of NKVD goons show up, I think, in the fifth episode, and we had some fun with that because I made them cartoon characters. But that is something that we'll touch on. We just haven't built out that part of the world as much yet because it is a lot on top of Nazis.
Cartoon characters like Natasha and Boris.
It's I that was a thought. Part of why we made the decision not to do Russian accents. A few of us used to work at the same, like, money side hustle day job, And we had one guy there who was a history teacher, and he's a really funny guy. And he would always go like, "Well, here's the problem with the Russian accent: is you can be a human being who you'll meet people from different cultures. You know, you can meet people from an Irish background, from like a Nigerian background, people who are from like El Salvador, people who have very thick, distinct accents just based on their like linguistic background. And the first thought in your mind is like, oh God, it would be so offensive to even try to imitate that to their person's face. Like that's awful. And then you meet someone who's Russian, and God, all that propaganda washes over you because the second someone who's Russian talks to you, you just go, "We must kill squirrel," and it is a horrific impulse that we're like, for some reason, it's not cool with most cultures, but it's cool to do that to the Russians. It's a weird double standard. But that's part of why we decided not to do Russian accents is it's already going to get kind of cartoonish enough to add on top of that, like, we are also talking like this. Now I say that there is a character in season 2 who I've been playing with a thick Russian accent, and it has been a lot of fun. I found an internal justification for it, which I can't wait for that episode to come out, so I'm very excited
Cool.
for that. But yeah, that's the linguistic thing there. But
yeah, I was thinking the only character, if you're trying to avoid Russian accents, that I would do an accent for would be Stalin on like a radio announcement or something.
Yeah, and even then, like the temptation then would to be like, "Hey, how you doing? It's me, your buddy Joey Stalin, the man of
Oh
steel.
my God, Joey Stalin. All right.
Your boy from Georgia."
Oh no.
We have a great respect for history at the Wing Women podcast.
That's okay. I don't think you need to respect Stalin with respect for history necessarily.
No.
And I know that a lot of what you were doing for the Wing Women podcast and how you were approaching it was bringing like queer perspectives to the game and the characters and the setting. And there's been some hinting of that in the early episodes, but not very much. Do you want to talk a bit about how that gets more explored in later episodes?
Yeah. So if anyone who's listened to the first 5 episodes, the 5th episode is where we kind of explicitly name a character as queer. And it is not anyone in the camp. And that was kind of a deliberate choice. One of the other things that interested me about this setting that, again, it felt unique for a TTRPG in particular, where I think our tendency, because actual plays and TTRPG stuff is such a great chance for escapism, is we then want to live in a world where, for those of us who are queer, myself included, you don't want to live in a world where that is an issue. So it becomes a great opportunity to live in those worlds. This setting obviously is the opposite. It was a crime, and quite a serious one in the Soviet Union, to be queer. It's an interesting example in kind of the same way where, to compare the Russians to the Nazis for a second, or at least the Soviet Union rather, that there was a very open and very active queer community, as far as I was able to determine, in a portion of Soviet society before the scapegoating started. I don't know if it was the same extent that you would have had in like Berlin in the 1930s, where it was still like an underground thing. Cabaret is kind of about this to some extent, the musical, but it's still an underground thing. It never reaches a point of mainstream acceptance, but it is something that is like, this was a part of life that you could kind of exist with, and then criminalized and punished and persecuted. And the same thing happens in Soviet Union in the 30s, where pre-30s, it was something that could happen, that was not unheard of. It was not officially a problem. I won't speak to any specific instances on that case. And then it is criminalized by Stalin, and queer expression is, for men, I think it was the Gulag, and for women, it was sanitarium.
Yeah, that was another question I had about that, is that I feel like the legal punishment for queer identity is usually very male-focused and kind of ignores women that are queer.
They didn't ignore it. I think I'm not a psychologist or a sociologist or anything. In my really quite amateur opinion, I would say that male sexuality, which I think is often more harshly punished as a reaction in history, from what I've seen, than female queer identities. Which is not to say it was not harshly punished. It's just that, like, at least in the Soviet Union, I think it was a more firm punishment. It comes down to, I think they viewed women as more easy to control, which is why they were like, cool, we'll just send them to the sanitarium. They just need to get their mind fixed. Whereas with the guys, men, I think it's like, well, they should know better. We're just going to take care of them. And I'll say both of those do not even begin to discuss trans identity issues, which I am not conversant in this social context whatsoever. I don't know to what extent it existed in this social context.
Yeah, I feel like that's one of those things that like we're seeing more trans people now because it's more acceptable to do that. Whereas like in the 40s or 30s when this is set and earlier, like you had to not do it. Like you couldn't express yourself that way unless you did it so fully and completely that no one noticed, in which case it becomes invisible in the other direction.
Yeah, which I don't. There are examples of in that time period. I'm not familiar with any from the Soviet Union of that kind of living as living as a gender identity that you may not have been assigned at birth in that time period. But like I said, I don't have the social awareness of it to be able to speak on it. But yeah, so that is the interesting thing about the queerness is there was a sexism to how it was punished even. Queer female identity was a matter of re-education, whereas I think queer male identity, from what I was able to find, was more just a matter of straight up punishment.
This is not necessarily off topic, but away from Russian identity, is my experience with like the trans bathroom issue that a lot of people are complaining about is kind of, you already are sharing bathrooms with trans people, you just don't know it.
Yeah,
people that pass well enough.
As a man who doesn't have a very discerning palate when it comes to the gender identity of my partner, and as someone who's deeply private as an individual, my thought has always been, who fucking cares?
Yes, that's also another aspect from my perspective.
And also, if you're trying to peek between the stalls in the bathroom, you're the asshole, and fucking stop. And why are you being a piece of shit and creep and a pervert about someone else's private business? It is on a very base level, homophobia is silly and transphobia is silly, to be quite honest. It's like, just stop being nosy. Just stop being nosy. That's not the whole view I have of it, but it at a base level, it's just like, just leave people alone. Yeah.
Even if it bothers you, just like, there's other things that people are allowed to do that bother me, and they're not illegal, and I just have to be okay with it because that's what living in a free society is.
Yeah. No one likes someone who's just shouting about crap on the bus, and that's all you are when you are like digging into people's private lives like that. Is you're just someone who people just fucking leave the world alone and let people be people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I guess it's not a great comparison, but just coming from like trying to understand that perspective of this thing that someone else is doing bothers me.
Mm-hmm.
Like when that happens to me, I don't go out and like try and legislate that behavior away necessarily. Like it'd have to be extremely egregious for me to want to do that. And someone wearing another gender's clothes and trying to pass that way, it's just like, even if that did bother me, why would I want to make it go away?
Yeah. Yeah, I always, because we live near Philadelphia, it's always just one of those things of like there are real problems that we have to deal with, that are so much more important than the discomfort of certain people who just don't understand something. Um, the amount of breath we waste on uh, topics about queer acceptance in society and how much people fight against it is so frustrating to me. When every goddamn time I take SEPTA, someone's smoking a cigarette on the subway. That is demonstrably worse for society on a medical level even. Like, let's just talk about cancer. Like can we just deal with that shit? I'm so tired of just all the gabbing about people and their lives and what people are when we can just deal with actual problems.
Yep. That's my perspective as well. Is there's even the cigarette on the subway, which is such a minor problem in the scope of societal problems when you look at other ones, is still, yes, a bigger one than someone being trans, because you can just look away from that person if it bothers you and boop, problem solved, compared to a cigarette where you can't really do that. Like you're there with the smoke and you have to deal with it.
Yeah.
Man, that was a tangent, but one worth doing, I think.
Yes. Anyway, fuck TERFs. Go ahead.
Right, back to the podcast. Because you're developing the plot more organically with very specific focuses, do you want to talk about like one or two things that you did in the first season for the theme for them coming together in that season?
Yeah, I mostly wanted to provide problems that they could either have an individual focus on or a group focus on. So, kind of the three major arcs of problems, I guess would be the way to think of it in the first season were in order. One of their planes is missing a propeller, which they kind of all individually approached to varying degrees of success, which I thought was really helpful because it illustrated like they can do things on their own. It's a lot harder than if they work together. The next problem was this issue surrounding a character in their unit who they were struggling with, who, as part of the propeller, getting a propeller for their plane, they were able to kind of put some of the attention on her. And then the reveal with her was that by doing so, they had unintentionally drawn attention to that person's gay husband. And how that could then be very bad for both of them. And that then became a big group discussion that they were able to kind of come to a group consensus on, but it was hard. It was very hard. And it was like the whole episode kind of turns into like that one scene in the Avengers when they're yelling about the Hulk and the scepter, where it's just an extended, like, you know, what's the best tactic here? How do you look out for yourself? How do you maintain the group cohesion? I love that episode. That's our 5th episode. And then kind of the final problem to deal with that solidifies the group identity, I think, is this intrusion of sexism from some of the men, where another consequence of the propeller thing was the brother of this guy, whose name is Constantine, because remember, it's an animated sitcom. He gets like reassigned, and like there's talk of like the NKVD got him. In reality, this guy would have been like punished. There might have been some issues, but like it would not be as bad as probably the rumors start to become. And he starts to mess with this unit as a result, so they have to kind of band together to fight against that external threat, and that kind of solidifies their cohesion as a group. And that was, I mean, I just threw out those problems with the hope that something like that might happen. Um, and the group just has a really great instinct for like storytelling beats like that. So we're able to hit on those, which I was really just really thrilled with because it does kind of encompass this the story of every basic training except maybe Full Metal Jacket, which is like, how do you come together and work as a group? And then Full Metal Jacket is, how do you break someone so that they kill you? Uh, but yeah, so that's
Well,
kind of
everyone else came together as a group in that movie.
yeah. Eventually, Animal Mother, he seemed cool, definitely, right? I haven't seen that movie. I haven't seen the second half of that movie, maybe ever. But first
No, I
40
was
minutes,
referring to the scene where they all beat Private Pile with soap in their socks.
oh God, poor Vincent D'Onofrio. I love him. That's a
He
good
did
point.
great.
Everyone else came together really well to beat the crap out of him with some soap bars.
Not exactly what you mean though.
No,
So is the coming together in the first season? Does that include the two NPC characters as well?
to some extent. The one of the NPCs, the two names are Sasha and Olya. Sasha, who is explicitly based on Val Kilmer's character from Top Gun, and Olya, who is kind of a gremlin of my own design, who kind of talks like this, like, "Hey guys, need some fun? Nah, don't worry." Um, and Olya was always like immediately kind of got on well with everybody because he just needed that energy. And then Sasha was very antagonistic because, as is Val Kilmer's character in Top Gun, thinks she's the best, acts like the best, has an issue with anyone else who thinks they might also be the best. The thing that I liked about it, certainly it becomes a more dimensional character than Top Gun, no disrespect to the great Val Kilmer, is because that is a movie that's focused on like the perspective of the Tom Cruise character who is also kind of dealing with his ego. It's just a clash of egos, whereas Sasha has developed strong ties with some of the members of the unit who she doesn't view as threats. Like she doesn't get on as well with Rita for the first season because her and Rita are in many ways direct competition. She doesn't get on well with Tatiana because she views Tatiana again as competition, and she also doesn't like Tatiana's how she interacts with the world. She develops a very strong friendship with Ninochka actually, because Ninochka is not a pilot; she's a navigator, and Ninochka is someone who's very good at kind of living in gray areas and playing support to other people is kind of built by August. So Sasha kind of gloms onto that and appreciates it. So really likes and views a lot of use in Ninochka. And I think Ninochka then is able to get stuff out of Sasha that others are not able to. So it's part of what I love about ensemble storytelling, which I am ever happy that one of the accolades we have received was last year, the 2023 Rainbow Roll Festival. We got Best Cast, and that's always my favorite award because it means everyone's great. And I love ensemble storytelling for that reason because, if you focus on one character, everyone else is going to come across through that character's perspective. But when you have all these different views and all these different personalities, and you can kind of find the empathy for any given one of your player characters, you get to see Sasha really isn't that bad of a person from the estimation of someone like Ninochka. I'm not going to completely say that because Sasha does some bad shit, but characters exist differently for different characters, which I just love as an actor.
Yeah, I was thinking of like the show is kind of like a sitcom almost, and we're doing like a Seinfeld like comparison that Sasha is kind of like Newman.
A little bit, yeah.
It's very antagonistic towards Jerry, but gets along well with pretty much the rest of the cast, I think.
I think so. It's just this irrational disdain that he and Jerry share. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. But yeah, then he's always doing some scheme with Kramer, and I feel like the other two he doesn't really care about. But
You don't get many George Newman episodes.
No.
Missed opportunity. Season 12, bring it back. We'll see it.
Man, there's that one Twitter account that's like modern Seinfeld episodes.
Oh, yeah. I think there's an equivalent Facebook group that I was in for a while. And then I'm only 26, but I remember there was one that was and I just read that it was, I think, a coffee shop between Elaine and Jerry. And I read the whole thing and I got to the end and I just thought I didn't understand a single thing that just happened. I don't know what's happening. I think I'm too old for this group. And I left it.
Yeah. Well, there's new sitcoms. We get those instead.
Yes.
Man, I feel like I touched on everything that I wanted to get to. Is there anything else that you wanted to bring in to talk about the show, or something that we missed?
I'll briefly get on my soapbox to talk about, we mentioned this, I think, when talking about the game book, but my disinterest in fantasy,
Sure.
which I think part of the impetus for this show, I think, was I got into gaming kind of the way everyone does ultimately. Like I got Fiasco, I ran a game night with it, kind of a hard game to run over Zoom. So when the pandemic hits, step away from it. And then like 6 months in, everyone in my social circle pretty much glommed onto either NADPOD, Dimension 20, or Critical Role, because you just have hours in the day where you can catch up on stuff. And then later, a couple of us got into Dungeons and Daddies, but like, there are these kind of titans of the actual play community that I think in 2020, everyone just kind of got into one of them, it felt like, if you were in nerd spaces. And the thing that has always been odd for me as someone who I'm very geeky, I love nerd stuff, I love popular culture, I've never really been able to connect with fantasy outside of like the biggest, strongest examples you can name. Like I love Lord of the Rings, but I don't go out of my way then to live in Lord of the Rings. I've never been able to connect with, like, I mentioned Piers Anthony earlier. I've tried some of his books, haven't been able to connect with them. The closest I can get to liking fantasy has always been parodies of fantasy. I love Terry Pratchett because he's funny, and that's kind of what I get out of his books, is the humor. And it was the same thing with the kind of boom was I had a lot of friends who got into Critical Role who love fantasy, and I've never, no disrespect to a very well constructed show and a very well constructed stream, I've never been able to develop an emotional connection with it. Whereas when Dimension 20 and then later Dungeons and Daddies kind of came into my life, I loved them, again, because they're kind of parody and they exist as like kind of absurd satire. And I love that aspect of it.
That's interesting because I feel like most people like parodies of like genres that they're interested in outside of the parody.
How do you mean?
So the Night and Day movie that Tom Cruise made is a parody of action movies. It's a very well done parody, so it almost tricks people into thinking that it is a real action movie. But it tends to, only be popular with people that like action movies and not people outside of that target audience. Does that make sense? So like it feels like it's a bit unusual to like parodies of a genre, but not the rest of that genre.
Yeah, I totally understand what you mean. Yeah, it is unusual. I like comedy. I'm a comedy fan. It's a strange statement because everyone likes to laugh, but I like the history of comedy, and I think that is part of maybe why I connect with it. What I connected with in Dimension 20 is they are also parodying high school movies, which I loved when I was in high school. So I think that's what I responded to with Fantasy High. And then Unsleeping City, which is kind of a parody of like New York City living and urban fantasy, which I do kind of connect a bit more with. I think it's a setting thing. I think I enjoyed that more because I did have more of a background with it. I think Dungeons and Daddies, what I'll highlight about that show that I loved so much that was so specific to its first season when I entered into it. I also come like I was a huge Freddie Wong fan growing up, so I had that background to kind of keep me going through the episodes. But
Uh-huh.
is it kind of exists as a parody of the absurdity of fantasy, where I don't think Pratchett, I think you get more out of if you like fantasy, but you can still enjoy because it's a little bit about how absurd fantasy storytelling is. And it's the same thing where if you look at fantasy storytelling and a society that is a D&D setting playbook through the lens of four guys from San Dimas, California, it is horrific and absurd. And it's just like, oh, yeah, we're going to go to the child fights. It's like, you guys have child fights? What the heck is going on? So I think that's maybe why I connected with it. All
Yeah,
that to then,
I guess I can see that also from the perspective of like Douglas Adams. Like The Hitchhiker's Guide is, I guess, technically a science fiction story, but that's not really what it's trying to do at all.
it was just the best. I showed that to my partner last year, and I remember at one point she got to like I think like a page 100 on an edition that has 130 pages, and she goes, "So is there gonna be a story, or is it just bits?" And I go, "I think it's just bits. It is. It took me. I read those when I was 10, and I love those books so much. I have them on my desk behind me.
Mhm.
I love those books. It's just bits. It is just it's like a vaudeville sketch. It's great. But yeah, that's I think I've always gone in for that kind of a thing where it's like Hitchhiker's Guide is the funniest book maybe of all time, and you don't need to be a sci-fi fan to understand why it's so funny.
Yeah.
Um, all that then to say that like I struggle with fantasy, and then the joke in 2021 I think everyone gets into is like, when are we going to start our podcast? Every D&D group, like the joke is, when do we start our podcast? And I was interested in the new media aspect of actual play podcast. I was interested in what it had to offer, both as someone who's an actor, as someone who's done writing, and just as someone who I consider myself a creative person in general. Like, it's such an interesting format. I just could not fathom myself running a game that was fantasy. So when I then walked into this bookshop, this game store, and I saw, like, yes, here is a World War II based non magical system written by a guy whose book you've already bought and loved, who has a structures games so they kind of feel like movies or TV episodes, and there's explicit queer themes, and it's nestled right between Pathfinder and Shadowrun. Ah, welcome home. um, so that I think just to jump on my soapbox and say, like, I love in the TTRPG space any storytelling then that is not fantasy. Not because I don't like fantasy, I just think because it has become the norm, I am always just so thrilled and so excited when I find something new. And I think part of why Night Witches in particular, why I think you at home should go out, buy Bully Pulpit Games' Night Witches book written by Jason Morningstar, and you should run it with your friends, is because it is a unique experience. It is a game unlike anything you will be able to experience playing D&D or Pathfinder or any of the other most popular systems, because it is unique in the story it's trying to tell. And I love it so much.
Yeah, I'm not really sure what to add on to that. That's a good explanation of it, for sure.
Thank you very much. I was not paid by Bully Pulpit Games, I promise. But hey, guys, if you want to pay me, my bank routing number is 081. No.
Yeah, well, the final question I always end on is, do you have any advice for other DMs? And I feel like you just kind of nailed it there, but I mean, do you have anything else you want to add on on that topic?
Yeah, I guess general GM advice. I'm a comparative novice to a lot of people. I've been running games for 4 years this October. I ran a Halloween one shot, and it's all been running out of that, where it was a dark fantasy version of Ferris Bueller's Day Off. It's a weird game. But yeah, the thing I return to, and what I love about the Night Witches system is problems. I so often will try to walk into a session And what's really a challenge I find about our show is we'll record 2 episodes at a time, so there's only so much planning I can do in advance because
Mm.
depending on how the first episode goes, maybe it doesn't make sense to go into the second episode plans. But the second episodes are always the better of the two, I found, because I'm actually reacting. This might just be me. I overthink stuff so easily, and I think it's so easy when you're planning out a TTRPG thing to overthink stuff. Boy, is it so fun to just give them a problem, and you're not even sure what the solution might be, and just see what your players come up with. Because your players are brilliant, wonderful people, just like how my players are brilliant, wonderful people, and they're going to surprise you, and then I think you'll surprise yourself. And then whether you're putting out an actual play or you're just hanging out with your friends, in a cabin in the woods, everything in between, it's so wonderful when the whole night becomes a surprise and something wonderful happens.
Yeah, I think that's what draws a lot of people to the hobby.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for coming on the show, Kevin. It was great having you here.
Thank you for having me, Isaac. It has been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you for listening. I've seen a lot of growth in the show over the last few months, and I'd like to keep it going. You can help by rating and reviewing the show on your favorite podcast app, telling a friend, or by telling any game masters you know to send in a survey to be on the show. You can find that survey at gocorral.com/STS. That's GOCORRAL.com/STS.